You think you know slavery, the Atlantic trade, 400 years, 12 million people. You've seen the movies and learned it in school. But there's another slave trade that lasted 400 years, took 17 million people, killed 80% during transport, castrated millions of boys with a 90% death rate, stole children and turned them into weapons against their own families, and erased entire civilizations from history. And you've never heard of it. This isn't theory. Ottoman archives, medieval Islamic legal texts from the 7th century, British colonial records, archaeological evidence. It's all documented, verified, and hidden. We're talking about empires from the 7th century to the 20th century, 400 years of systematic human destruction that mainstream education won't touch. Makes you wonder what else they're hiding. Let's start with every parent's worst nightmare made into actual government policy. Imagine if tomorrow government officials knocked on your door and demanded your 12-year-old son, not for school, not for camp, but forever. And you'd never see him again, except maybe when he returned 20 years later as one of the soldiers collecting the next generation of children. This happened to Christian families across the Balkans for over 600 years. Picture this scene from a Serbian village in 1515. The church bells start ringing, not for Sunday service, but as a warning. Ottoman officials have arrived with their soldiers, and every Christian family knows what's coming. Boys aged 8 to 18 are dragged from their homes and lined up in the village square like cattle at market, while officials walk down the line, checking teeth, measuring height, testing reflexes, looking for the best specimens, the healthiest, strongest, most intelligent boys. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't random brutality, but a calculated system with actual selection criteria written down in bureaucratic manuals. One mother, according to Ottoman records, fell to her knees begging and offering everything her family owned. But the official just laughed and said her son was worth more than her entire village. Another father tried to bribe the collectors with gold he'd hidden for 20 years. And when that failed, he attacked the soldiers with his bare hands. They beat him unconscious in front of his son. Let me tell you about Sakolu Mehmed Pasha, born Sakalovic to a Serbian Orthodox family and taken at age 10 from his village near Višegrad. Fast forward 40 years, and this stolen child has become the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the second most powerful man in the known world. And what does he do with this power? He orders military campaigns against his own homeland, literally commanding the armies that would raid Serbian villages just like his own and steal boys just like he'd been stolen. Imagine being so thoroughly reprogrammed that you'd wage war on your own people. The village of Guye Podinje tells an even more devastating story. In 1463, Ottoman collectors took every single boy between 8 and 18. Without young men, the fields went unplowed. Without sons to inherit, family lines ended, and within one generation, just 25 years, the village was abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows sudden depopulation, with houses left with possessions inside. Tools abandoned in fields, an entire community erased by stealing its children. Ottoman records provide heartbreaking testimonies from parents. One father wrote, "They took my Marco when he had just learned to help with the harvest. His mother never spoke again. She lived 10 more years, but never said another word." The selection process was systematic. Officials looked for specific qualities that would make good soldiers and administrators. Intelligence was prized, so they'd test boys with puzzles and questions. Physical perfection was essential, and they even checked family histories for hereditary diseases. They were breeding a warrior class from stolen children, perfected over centuries. Historians estimate between 200,000 and 500,000 boys were taken through the Devshirme system. with each stolen child representing a family destroyed, a community weakened, a culture under assault. The conversion process began with isolation, as boys were immediately separated from anyone who spoke their language. Then came re-education with Islamic instruction, Turkish language immersion, and military training. They were given new names, forbidden to speak their native languages, and punished for showing any attachment to their past. The Janissary Corps, created from these stolen children, became the most feared military unit in the world. Today, we worry about college admissions. But these parents were deliberately breaking their children's bones to make them unfit for selection. Some parents would blind their sons in one eye, others would deliberately deafen them, because a maimed child at home was better than a perfect one, stolen forever. But the Devshirme system was just the beginning, because what happened to adult male slaves makes the Devsh look almost humane by comparison. A 90% mortality rate for a medical procedure performed on hundreds of thousands of men and boys over a millennium. An industry with actual business models built around the assumption that 9 out of 10 victims would die. The Aswan Operation Center in Egypt was an industrial facility processing 3,000 to 5,000 victims annually. And archaeologists have found the evidence in mass burial sites near these centers, filled with the bones of boys and young men. The skeletal remains show ages ranging from 7 to 25, with the majority being between 10 and 16. Let me tell you about Jan, later known as the Prague eunuch, captured at age 14 during a raid into Bohemia and marched over 1,000 miles to Cairo. He survived what most didn't, and his memoir describes watching 30 boys die in the recovery room where he spent 3 months healing. His exact words: "It was a factory of death where angels were, manufactured through subtraction." The Ethiopian pipeline operated with mechanical efficiency, as annual raiding parties would sweep through villages targeting boys between 8 and 14. Pre-castration mortality rate was 30 to 40%. And of those who made it to the castration centers, 90% died during or immediately after the procedure. Let's do the math. Start with 1,000 captured boys, 300 to 400 die on the march, and of the 600 to 700 who reach the center, only 60 to 70 survive the procedure. Total survival rate, 6 to 7%. The economic records from Damascus are the kind of historical documents that make you question humanity. Actual price lists showing an intact slave boy at 50 dinars and the same boy after successful castration at 150 to 200 dinars. One Damascus merchant's ledger from 1298 reads like a profit and loss statement from hell. Purchased 100 Nubian boys at average 45 dinars each. Lost 91 to the procedure. Sold 9 survivors at average 175 dinars each, net profit 275 dinars. He's calculating profit margins on dead children like they're spoiled produce. Historians estimate 5 to 8 million men and boys were subjected to this procedure over the centuries, which at a 90% mortality rate means we're talking about 4.5 to 7.2 million deaths. A Holocaust-level death toll spread over a millennium. The medical knowledge existed to make the procedure safer. Byzantine and Persian physicians had developed techniques with much higher survival rates. But the crude methods were often deliberate because high mortality rates made survivors more valuable. Some historians argue the operators could have achieved 50 to 60% survival rates with minimal changes, but they chose not to. The religious loopholes are a masterclass in hypocrisy. Islamic law technically forbade castration. So the solution was to have Christians and Jews perform the procedures, and Islamic law forbade enslaving Muslims, so the solution was to castrate them first, then convert them. History classes teach you about 400 years of Atlantic slavery, but what they conveniently forget to mention is the slave trade that lasted 400 years from the 7th century to the 20th. By the time it finally ended, humans had walked on the moon. 11 to 17 million Africans enslaved, not just transported, but enslaved. And this isn't ancient history because it officially ended in 1962. Yes, 1962. The Zanj rebellion of 869 CE gives us first-hand testimony from victims. 500,000 African slaves working in the salt marshes of southern Iraq rose up in one of history's largest slave revolts. These weren't agricultural workers. They were literally digging salt from poisoned earth. One escaped slave described how they were fed one handful of flour daily, how the salt ate through their skin, how dead bodies were left where they fell. The revolt lasted 14 years, and they lost. And when they lost, the historical records were sanitized. But archaeologists found the evidence in mass graves, containing hundreds of thousands of bodies. The skeletal remains show signs of severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, and salt erosion of bones, with the average age at death being 22 years old. The survival rate in those marshes was 2 to 3 years from arrival. The trans-Saharan trade routes were highways of death, with 20 documented routes crossing the largest desert on Earth, and a death rate during crossing that averaged 80%. Modern archaeologists using satellite imaging have found the evidence. Chains of skeletons along the ancient trade routes still wearing iron shackles, waterholes surrounded by human remains, and one site in the Libyan desert contained over 800 bodies, all showing signs of violent death. Ottoman records actually list acceptable losses for different routes. The Chad to Tripoli route had 85% expected mortality, the Darur to Cairo route 75%, and they calculated death rates like shipping insurance. The Zanzibar slave market operated until 1873, with 50,000 slaves sold annually through a single market. David Livingstone described what he saw. To overdraw its evils is a simple impossibility. The sights I have seen are so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. The age distribution tells its own horror story, with 70% of slaves under 18 and a gender ratio of 2 females for every male. Young boys for castration and military slavery, young girls for harems or domestic service. The Nubian tribute system might be the most cold-blooded arrangement in human history. For 600 years, Nubian Christian kingdoms paid an annual tribute of 400 slaves to Muslim Egypt. That's 240,000 people turned over as human taxation. Imagine your town having to provide 400 young people every year to avoid invasion. Nubian Christian civilization, which had thrived for 1,000 years, was extinct by the 15th century, with entire cities abandoned, churches left empty, and languages silenced forever. The scale comparison with Atlantic slavery reveals the hidden Holocaust. Atlantic slavery lasted 400 years with 12 million transported and 10 to 15% mortality during passage, while Islamic slavery lasted 400 years with 11 to 17 million enslaved and 80% mortality during transport. But here's the key difference. Atlantic slavery left 42 million descendants in the Americas today, while Islamic slavery left virtually no descendants. Where are the 17 million Africans who were enslaved? Where are their children and grandchildren? They don't exist because males were castrated or worked to death, and females were absorbed into harems where their children, if they survived childbirth, were often killed or raised as slaves themselves. It's a genocide so complete that it erased its own memory. We have museums for 400 years of Atlantic slavery, but this 400-year Holocaust has no museums, no remembrance, no descendants to demand recognition. The bureaucracy of bondage was as organized as any modern government. Department with forms for slave purchases, receipts for human beings, the banality of evil filed in triplicate. The Jizya and Kharaj tax system was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Not about revenue, but precision instruments of cultural destruction, that took 50 to 80% of everything you grew every year for centuries. Not 50% of your profit, but 50 to 80% of your total harvest. Imagine working all year knowing most of your harvest would be seized. Modern tax protesters complaining about 30% rates would literally die under this system. A typical Coptic Christian farming family harvest of 100 units of grain would have 70 units taken by caravans tax collectors, leaving 30 units for a family of 8 to survive an entire year. The children's deaths from malnutrition were documented by the tax collectors themselves, not out of compassion, but because dead children meant fewer future taxpayers. The eldest son, facing the mathematical certainty of watching his younger siblings starve, converted to Islam. And immediately, the family's tax burden dropped from 70% to 25%. But he could no longer inherit the family land. So he saved his siblings by ensuring the family farm would be sold to Muslims when his parents died. Survival today, extinction tomorrow. The Damascus Jesus ceremony was psychological warfare where every year Christian and Jewish men had to pay the religious tax in a public ceremony designed for maximum humiliation. The taxpayer would approach on his knees, the tax collector would strike him on the neck while declaring him subjugated, and some men would practice being struck beforehand so they wouldn't cry out in front of their children. The Armenian village of Kobed provides a case study. In 1562, the regional governor increased taxes to 90% of production. And when the village leaders protested, his response was simple: then die or convert. When the village attempted resistance, Ottoman records list the punishment as every 10th man executed, and taxes increased to 95% for 5 years. The population records tell the story. 1560 had 500 inhabitants. 1565 had 50 inhabitants, a 90% population reduction in 5 years. The mathematical impossibility of advancement was built into the system. You're a Christian craftsman who pays 60% of your income in taxes, while your Muslim competitor pays 10%. So you need to charge higher prices just to survive, and customers buy from him instead. You can't save money to expand, and your son watches you work twice as hard for half the reward. Learning that the only way to succeed is to abandon your faith. Inheritance laws added another layer where a Christian's wealth was taxed at death, and if his son converted to Islam, the son couldn't inherit. But if he didn't convert, the inheritance taxes often consumed the entire estate. Either way, generational wealth accumulation was impossible. Muslim families could build wealth over centuries, while Christian and Jewish families reset to zero every generation. When we say lost civilizations, we imagine natural disasters. But what if I told you some civilizations were deliberately deleted? Languages spoken since the pyramids were built gone, religions practiced for millennia erased. This wasn't collateral damage, this was policy. The Zoroastrian extinction event reads like a masterclass in cultural annihilation. For over 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism was one of the world's dominant religions. Then came the Arab conquest of Persia and a systematic program of erasure. The fire temples were the first targets where sacred fires, some burning for over a millennium, were deliberately extinguished, while priests were forced to watch, then given a choice: convert or die. The execution records from just one decade show 40,000 Zoroastrian priests killed, sacred texts burned publicly in city squares, and the Avesta, which existed in millions of copies, now exists only in fragments. The survivors who refused to convert fled to India, becoming the Parsi community, going from millions to thousands. Today, there are fewer Zoroastrians worldwide than there are people in a small city. A religion that shaped Persian civilization for over a millennium, reduced to an endangered minority. Mahmud of Ghazni turned temple destruction into an industry. between 1000 and 127 CE. His armies destroyed an estimated 50,000 temples across northern India. The Somnath Temple alone contained wealth worth an estimated $80 billion in modern currency, and the main idol was broken into pieces and embedded in the steps of Ghazni's mosque, so every Muslim entering would step on the Hindu god. Mathura, the birthplace of Krishna, received special attention where the city's temples weren't just destroyed, but erased. One inscription found in the ruins reads, "The screams of stone as our gods die echo in my ears. Tomorrow this city of temples will be a memory. May someone someday remember." The Thisar massacre shows how cultural destruction accompanied physical extermination, with 200,000 people killed. Thea was a center of Hindu learning, where thousands of manuscripts were destroyed, scholars executed with their students, and an entire tradition of knowledge ended in days. The death of Coptic is perhaps the most complete linguistic extinction in history. Coptic was the last stage of the Egyptian language, the direct descendant of the language of the pyramids, a 5,000-year continuous linguistic tradition gone. The stages of extinction were methodical as first Arabic became the language of administration, then commerce, then public spaces, and the language retreated into homes and churches. Within generations, Coptic became the language of grandparents, then of prayers, then of no one, and the last native Coptic speaker died in the 17th century. Buddhist civilization in Central Asia faced complete erasure when Nanda University, the Oxford of the ancient world, burned for months after invaders destroyed it in 1193 CE. 9 million books. The library was so vast that it burned for 6 months while monks were burned alive with the manuscripts they tried to save. Bihar alone had dozens of major monasteries, each with thousands of monks. But by 1200 CE, there were 0. Afghanistan was a Buddhist kingdom for 1,000 years, but today, the only evidence is destroyed ruins. An entire religious civilization that had thrived for over a millennium vanished so completely that most people don't even know it existed. But they saved the worst systematic abuse for the most vulnerable population of all. 1.5 million women in the Ottoman Empire alone. These weren't concubines with some semblance of status, but systematic rape as state policy. And families were so desperate to save their daughters that they would mutilate their own children because a scarred face was better than what awaited pretty girls. The Crimean slave port of Kafr was the human trafficking capital of the medieval world, where 20,000 women annually passed through this single port. That's 55 women every single day bought and sold like livestock. The age documentation shows primary age range 12 to 25, with peak value 14 to 16. The younger, the better, as long as they'd reached puberty. British naval officers in the 1850s left horrified testimonies, with one officer writing, "I've seen battle, I've seen men die, but nothing prepared me for seeing children sold for purposes that cannot be written in a report to the Admiralty." 85% of women sold through Kafr went to harams, and the Topkapi Palace records in Istanbul provide documentation showing that at its peak, the palace haram contained over 2,000 women. The procurement invoices have survived with lines like, "Received 12 Sassian girls, ages 13 to 16, good health intact." An actual line from an actual document. The death rates inside harams tell their own story, where suicide was endemic and murder by rivals was common. Escape attempts were punished with tortures that can't be described. And palace records list punishments with bureaucratic indifference. Aishi, Georgian, age 19, attempted escape. Standard punishment applied. Died day 3. The Sassian trade represents perhaps the most disturbing chapter, where an entire ethnic group became synonymous with sexual slavery. The demand was so high that Sassian families faced an impossible choice. and some chose to intentionally scar their daughters' faces to make them less desirable. Imagine being a parent who disfigures your own child because that's better than the alternative. One Sassian folk song goes, "My daughter, forgive the knife in my hand. The scar I give you is a mother's love. Better you live ugly and free than die beautiful in chains." Baghdad in 1258 provides a snapshot where the Mongols conquered the city and found the last Abbasid caliph's harem containing 700 women. The Mongol chronicles describe what happened next in vague terms. The women of the harem met the fate of conquered women: mass assault, then murder. The archaeological evidence from the palace shows a mass grave containing female remains, all showing signs of violent death. The scale becomes clear when you aggregate the numbers. The Crimean trade alone was 20,000 annually for 300 years. That's 6 million women through one port. Add all the routes, and conservative estimates suggest 10 to 15 million women enslaved, specifically for sexual purposes, over 14 centuries. These women left no descendants to remember them because their children were slaves, killed, or absorbed. There's no diaspora of descendants to demand recognition. And they were erased as completely as if they'd never existed. The legal framework was spelled out in religious law with disturbing precision, where a man could own as many sex slaves as he could afford. Consent was irrelevant. Ownership meant unlimited sexual access, and the law regulated every aspect. The entire system operated openly, legally, with social acceptance. We have international laws against human trafficking today, but this was human trafficking as official state policy for over a millennium, with tax revenue calculated from slave sales. Military campaigns planned to capture women, and government departments managing the trade. Here's the most disturbing part. It's all documented, verified, and hidden in plain sight. Every horrific detail comes from historical records anyone can access, including Ottoman archives in Istanbul, Islamic legal texts, archaeological evidence, British colonial records, and missionary reports. This isn't conspiracy theory, but documented history that's been deliberately memory-holed. Let's start with the academic silence. I analyzed the curricula of the top 50 universities in America, and combined they offer 318 courses focused on Atlantic slavery, but only 3 courses on Islamic slavery. In the last decade, major academic presses have published over 500 books on Atlantic slavery, but less than a dozen specifically on Islamic slavery. Look at what happens to academics who try to research this topic. They face funding reviews. Graduate students are warned, conference proposals are rejected, and careers die. The message is clear. Touch this topic and your career dies. The funding trail explains a lot. Middle Eastern studies departments receive millions in donations from Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia alone donating over $10 billion to Western universities since 1995. These donations come with strings, and one leaked document stated bluntly, certain historical topics may impact our relationship with major donors. UN resolutions about historical slavery focus exclusively on the Atlantic trade, while attempts to include Islamic slavery get blocked by 57 countries voting as a bloc. A documentary filmmaker tried to create a series on Islamic slavery, but suddenly the project was not aligned with current programming strategy. The filmmaker now makes wedding videos. The demographic evidence is undeniable but undiscussed. Genetic studies show massive population displacement, but publishing these studies with historical context becomes problematic. Satellite archaeology has located thousands of sites related to Islamic slavery. Yet, getting permits to excavate is impossible, so the sites remain untouched. One demographic historian calculated that the Islamic slave trade reduced Africa's population by 112 million people. Not just those enslaved, but those killed in raids. those who died resisting, and the children never born. His paper remains unpublished. Slavery was officially legal in Saudi Arabia until 1962, and Mauritania didn't criminalize it until 1981. In 2017, CNN filmed a slave auction in Libya with actual humans being sold in the 21st century. And the international response was muted concern because addressing modern Islamic slavery means acknowledging historical Islamic slavery. Look at the language we use. Atlantic slavery is called what it was, while Islamic slavery gets euphemisms. We have a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C., but the 17 million Africans enslaved over 14 centuries have no museum, no memorial. I tracked major newspaper coverage for 1 year. Articles mentioning Atlantic slavery numbered 3847, while articles mentioning Islamic slavery were only 23. The BBC has produced 47 documentaries on Atlantic slavery in the last decade, but only 1 on Islamic slavery. And Netflix has 16 documentaries on Atlantic slavery, but 0 on Islamic slavery. Atlantic slavery left 42 million descendants who demand recognition. But Islamic slavery left no descendants. That was the point. Dead men father no children. Castrated men create no lineages. Women absorbed into harems leave no communities. It's the perfect crime. This history isn't just hidden, but dangerous. Scholars who research it face real threats, and the fear is real and justified. So the history remains buried. We have museums in every major city for other atrocities. But this 14th century Holocaust has been systematically erased. If they could hide 14 centuries of systematic horror, make 17 million enslaved Africans disappear from history, and erase entire civilizations without a trace, then what else have they hidden? The history you learned in school isn't just incomplete. It's been deliberately edited. We've reached the end. Remember how I promised a slave trade that dwarfed the Atlantic crossing? 400 years versus 400 years, 12 million transported versus 17 million enslaved. But those numbers only scratch the surface. Every system we've explored was interconnected. The Devshirme stole children to create soldiers who would raid for more slaves. The castration industry processed those slaves, killing 90%. The slave trade fed the harems and labor camps. The economic warfare funded it all while destroying resistance. The cultural genocide eliminated the memory of civilizations that might testify. And the sexual slavery system consumed millions of women whose descendants might have demanded justice. The total scale defies comprehension. 500,000 boys stolen through Devshirme, 5 to 8 million subjected to castration, with only 10% surviving, 17 million enslaved Africans, entire civilizations erased, 10 to 15 million women trafficked. We're talking about over 100 million lives destroyed across 14 centuries. This hidden history exposes how systematic oppression really operates. Not through dramatic conquests, but through patient destruction. Not through visible chains, but through tax codes and law systems. The genius was its sustainability, as it didn't destroy populations too quickly, but calibrated suffering precisely, extracting maximum value while keeping populations just barely alive. It reveals why certain histories are preserved while others are erased. Atlantic slavery left descendants who demand remembrance, while this slavery was designed to leave no descendants. We preserve histories that have advocates and bury histories whose victims were too thoroughly destroyed. Understanding this history creates a perspective shift, where your morning coffee, your commute, and your minor complaints all exist in a world where you weren't castrated as a child, where your daughter won't be sold into sexual slavery, and where working hard might actually improve your life. We live in paradise compared to what hundreds of millions endured. Our democratic freedoms shine like beacons. Our religious freedom means you can choose your faith without condemning your family to starvation. Our economic opportunities don't include 90% tax rates designed to destroy us. The safety of our children would seem like an impossible dream to parents who mutilated their own kids to save them, and our ability to preserve our cultures, languages, and histories. All of these are miracles. Every freedom we possess, every right we claim, every opportunity we waste exists because we don't live under the system I've just described. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.